23 chairs are arranged in a loose circle in a room that is not quite empty and not quite full. On each chair rests a folded slip of paper. The slips are uniform, the same pale color, the same small rectangular fold, and from the doorway they appear identical. Each one holds a date written in ordinary handwriting, a day and a month, nothing else. The room is quiet in the way rooms are quiet before anyone has arrived to disturb them, and the coincidence is already there, already settled into two of those folded papers, like a small and patient fact, waiting in the silence before anyone has thought to look. No one has turned their slip over yet. The date is not yet spoken, but in the arithmetic of the room, which does not need anyone to recite it aloud in order to be true, two of those 23 papers carry the same birthday, and they have been sitting across the circle from each other, or perhaps adjacent, for as long as the slips have been laid down. The room holds the coincidence the way a room holds warmth from the previous day, quietly, without announcement, simply as a condition of its being. This is where the mathematics begins, not in a lecture hall, not with a formula written on a board. It begins in a room with 23 chairs and 23 folded pieces of paper, and a fact that is already true before anyone has checked. The result that makes probabilists pause and that continues to unsettle the intuitions of otherwise careful thinkers is this. In a group of just 23 people, the probability that at least two of them share the same birthday exceeds 50%. Not a near certainty, not a strong likelihood. More likely than not, a coin flip that lands, more often than not, on the side of shared dates. When this result is presented to people encountering it for the first time, the most common response is not acceptance, but a polite, firm form of disbelief, the inner conviction that the number must be wrong, that the actual threshold must be somewhere much higher, somewhere closer to the full span of the calendar. The formal name for this result in the literature of probability theory is the birthday paradox. The word paradox here does not mean a logical contradiction. It means something that feels wrong and turns out to be right, a result that sits comfortably inside mathematics and uncomfortably inside human intuition. The probability does exceed 50% at 23 people. The mathematics is not in dispute. What is in dispute, at least for anyone encountering it the first time, is the intuition that told them it should not be. To understand why the result is what it is, rather than what intuition says it should be, requires turning attention away from any single person in the room and toward the connections between all of them. A room of 23 people does not contain 23 birthdays sitting separately, each one waiting to be compared against the calendar. It contains 253 unique pairings, 253 pairs of individuals, each pair representing a potential match. The first person in the room can be compared with 22 others. The second person, setting aside the first, can be compared with 21 others, and so on, down through the group until the last pair has been counted. 253 pairings, each of them a small independent question about whether two dates happen to coincide. 253 is a larger number than it sounds. Each of those pairings is an independent opportunity for a match to occur, and the probability that none of them produces a match, that all 253 pairings draw from the calendar and come up different every single time, is the complement of what is being measured. When those independent non-match probabilities are multiplied across all 253 pairs, the product falls below 50%, which is another way of saying that the probability of at least one match exceeds 50%. The mathematics works by accumulation, not by a single dramatic alignment, but by the quiet, patient layering of chances that pair by pair add up to something the intuition would not have predicted. The error most people make when they first consider the birthday problem is not a calculation error, it is a framing error. The natural instinct is to imagine a single person standing in a room and asking whether anyone else shares their birthday. That is a different question with a different answer, a question whose probability does not exceed 50% until the room contains roughly 253 people. The birthday paradox is asking something else. It is asking whether any two people in the room share a birthday without specifying which two. The moment that shift in framing is made, from one person comparing against all others to all pairs comparing against each other, the number drops dramatically from the hundreds down to 23. The coincidence everyone imagines is much harder to find than the coincidence that actually exists. The probability curve that maps this relationship between group size and shared birthday probability rises steeply in the lower numbers and then flattens into near certainty well before the calendar's full span of days has been reached. By the time a group reaches 70 people, the probability of at least two of them sharing a birthday has climbed to approximately 99.9%. Not a virtual certainty, not almost guaranteed. For practical purposes, certain. Any gathering of 70 or more, any moderately sized meeting room, any school assembly for a small grade, any gathering around a medium-sized dinner table with extended family and their families is almost guaranteed to contain at least one shared birthday. The odds have already been decided before the guests arrive. This means that in most classrooms in most countries, a shared birthday is not a remarkable coincidence, but a near statistical requirement. And a classroom of 30 students has an approximately 70% probability of containing a birthday match. A classroom of 35 students pushes that figure past 80%. By 40 students, the probability has climbed well above 90. All of this happens in groups that are still small enough for every member to know every other member's name, groups that feel intimate and particular rather than statistical. The mathematics does not care about intimacy. It counts pairings, and the pairings accumulate faster than the sense of smallness suggests they should. Beyond probability, there is a point at which shared birthdays stop being likely and become certain. The principle that marks this transition has a name that sounds more technical than it is. The pigeonhole principle states something very simple. If more items exist than available containers, at least one container must hold more than one item. In the domain of birthdays, the available containers are the 365 days of a standard calendar year. If the group has more members than there are days in the year, if it has 366 or more people, then at least two of them must share a birthday. There is no arrangement of those people across the calendar that avoids it. The mathematics has moved from probability into certainty, the same way water moves from possible to inevitable when the vessel is filled past its brim. The pigeonhole principle is old in the sense that its logic has been clear to anyone who thought about it since the idea of a calendar was formalized. The name comes from the wooden mail cabinets, once common in hotels and offices, the kind built into the wall in rows and columns, each small square compartment holding letters for one guest or one resident. When the hotel is not full, every letter sits in its own slot without crowding. When more letters arrive than slots exist, the letters begin to share. The cabinet does not decide which ones share. The arithmetic decides. The cabinet simply holds what the arithmetic requires. What is quieter and more surprising than the pigeonhole certainty? Because certainty, once understood, is just a fact. is the steepness of the probability curve in the region between 0 and 70 people. The curve does not rise slowly and steadily the way a ramp rises. It rises steeply at first, reaching 50% at 23 people, and then continuing upward at a rate that makes the intuition feel slow. By 30 people, the probability is already 70%. By 50 people, it is 97%. The curve is bending hard to the right, well before most people imagine it should be bending at all. And by 70, it has nearly reached the ceiling, the flat portion of the curve that represents near certainty, while the calendar still has nearly 300 unused days. That shape, the steep rise followed by the wide flat plateau, is part of what makes the birthday paradox so persistently useful as a demonstration in probability courses. The shape of the curve is itself a lesson in how exponential processes differ from linear ones. Human intuition tends to model probability as a linear climb. More people means proportionally more chance of a match, in roughly the same way that more rolls of a die means proportionally more sixes. Exponential growth does not behave this way. It accelerates. The curve climbs faster per person added when the group is small, and the pairings are accumulating rapidly. And the perception of that acceleration, when students see the curve for the first time, produces a kind of recalibration that stays with them. The teaching tradition around the birthday paradox has its own informal history. For decades, instructors of statistics and probability have used a version of the same classroom experiment. Ask every student to call out their birth month and day and see what happens. The experiment works because it takes an abstract probability and turns it into a moment, a specific, audible, room silencing moment when two students say the same date and the room goes still. In a class of 23, roughly half the time, that moment arrives. In a class of 30, it arrives roughly 7 times in 10. The experiment has been replicated in every kind of classroom, in every kind of institution, across decades of statistics instruction, and the empirical results align reliably with theoretical predictions. What the classroom moment demonstrates is not simply that the mathematics is correct. Any doubter of the mathematics can be shown the derivation without needing an experiment. What the moment demonstrates is the felt difference between knowing something to be likely and experiencing it as real. A student who has calculated the 50% threshold in homework and nodded at the result still feels something shift when two voices in the room call out the same birthday. The shift is not quite surprise and not quite recognition. It is something between the two, the sensation of an abstract result becoming concrete, of a number finding its human form in a room full of particular people who did not know until that moment that the mathematics had already connected them. There is a documented pattern in how people estimate the birthday problem threshold before they encounter the mathematics. Even individuals with strong training in mathematics, people who work with probability regularly and understand exponential growth in their professional contexts, tend, when asked to estimate intuitively and quickly, to place the 50% threshold somewhere between 180 and 200 people, rather than at 23. The gap between the intuitive estimate and the true answer is not small. It is not a rounding error or a slight miscalibration. It is an estimate that is roughly 8 to 9 times higher than the correct answer. The reason for this persistent overestimate has a name in cognitive psychology: scope insensitivity. Scope insensitivity is the documented tendency to fail to scale estimates proportionally when the quantities involved grow in ways that are not linear. When the number of pairings in a group grows much faster than the number of people in that group, the mind's estimate of probabilities tends to lag behind the actual growth. The mind scales its estimate by the number of people, a quantity that feels familiar and trackable, rather than by the number of pairings, which is the quantity that actually drives the probability. 23 people feels like a small fraction of 365 days. 253 pairings, each representing an independent chance of a match, is a harder quantity to hold in mind without deliberate effort. Scope insensitivity is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of how human estimation works in the absence of calculation. The same cognitive tendency appears in studies of environmental risk perception, in estimates of statistical mortality, in assessments of large numbers of any kind. The mind is well calibrated for quantities it has encountered at a human scale: the number of people in a family, the number of days in a month, the number of steps to walk a familiar distance. It is less well calibrated for quantities that grow exponentially, or for cases where the relevant unit is not the obvious one. 253 pairings do not feel like 23 people. They feel, when thought about carefully, like more people than are in the room, which is precisely the point. The experienced mathematician who writes down an estimate of 180 people before crossing it out and writing 23 is not making a mistake in calculation. The calculation, when performed deliberately, comes out correctly. The mistake is in the initial unreflective intuition, the fast answer that the mind offers before the slow answer has been requested. What makes the birthday paradox durable as a teaching tool is exactly this. It is one of the few problems where the fast answer and the slow answer diverge so dramatically that the correction produces a small, memorable reorientation, not an unpleasant one, a pleasant one. The feeling of being wrong in a direction that turns out to be interesting. 23 people in a room is not a large gathering. It is the size of a meeting that fits around an ordinary conference table. It is smaller than most classrooms, smaller than most dinner parties of any ambition, smaller than the group of people one might see on a short city block at any given moment. And in that small, ordinary, everyday group of 23, the mathematics has already arranged, more likely than not, for at least 2 people to share the same calendar date for their birthday. The arranging was done not by any intent or design, but by the quiet logic of accumulated pairings, each one small, each one contributing its fraction of probability to the whole. The classroom of 23 students finds its way back here as an image worth sitting with for a moment. Each student has arrived with an ordinary fact about themselves, the month and day of their birth, a piece of information they have known since childhood, printed on documents and celebrated annually, so familiar it feels almost like a physical feature rather than a fact. They are carrying their birthday the way they carry their height or the color of their eyes, as something given, particular theirs, and without knowing it, each one of them has already entered into 252 silent pairings with everyone else in the room. The pairings exist before anyone speaks. They exist before anyone has asked. They are a property of the group's composition, settled into the mathematics of the room the moment the 23rd person took their seat. The folded slips of paper on the 23 chairs are a version of this. Each slip holds a fact that feels private and particular. A birthday is a personal date, associated with one's own history, one's own accumulation of years and celebrations. But the room holds all 23 of those private dates simultaneously, and across the 253 pairings they form, the probability that at least 2 of them are the same is already greater than 50%. The coincidence does not require anyone to search for it. It does not require anyone to want it to be there. It simply is there, or it is not, with probabilities that favor its presence in the room. What makes this result feel like more than an arithmetic fact is the quality of the surprise it produces. The surprise is not the sharp, disorienting kind, the kind that demands resolution or explanation, the kind that insists something must be done about it. It is a softer kind of surprise, the discovery that a world one thought one understood has been arranged differently, more densely connected, more full of quiet coincidences than the standard mental model suggested. The birthday paradox does not change anything about how birthdays work. It changes something about how the room looks, which is a subtler and in some ways more lasting kind of change. A room of 23 people, seen through the lens of the birthday paradox, is a room full of invisible threads. Most of the threads lead nowhere particular. 240 of those threads, roughly, connect pairs of people who do not share a birthday, and those threads carry no weight, produce no event, register nowhere. But among the 253 pairings in a group of this size, the probability says that the remaining threads, the ones that do connect two people who share a date, are more likely to exist than not. They are already there, or they are almost certainly about to be found. The room is more connected than it appears from the doorway. This matters in a quiet way because the birthday paradox generalizes. It is not only about birthdays. Shared dates are simply the clearest, most concrete example of a principle that applies wherever discrete matching is possible. Shared initials, shared last digits of phone numbers, shared hometowns, shared departure flights. In any domain where items are drawn from a finite pool, matched against each other across all possible pairings in a group, the number of people required to make a match more likely than not is almost always far smaller than intuition suggests. The birthday case happens to be the most documentable and the most demonstrable because everyone knows their birthday and almost no one refuses to say it, which makes the classroom experiment so reliably replicable. Probability instructors who have run the birthday experiment for 30 or 40 years report that the classroom moment of discovery does not lose its quality of gentle surprise with repetition. The instructor knows the result. The instructor has seen the result confirmed hundreds of times. And yet, in a class where the shared birthday appears on the second name called, there is still something that registers, not surprise exactly, but the pleasure of a well-timed confirmation, of seeing the abstract instantiate in the particular, again in this room, with these people, in this unrepeatable configuration of human beings who have each carried their birthday in from the street without knowing what the room was about to do with it. The probability curve that governs all of this rises steeply, reaches 50% at 23, keeps rising through the 50s and 60s of group size, and then, somewhere in the early 70s, begins to flatten. The flattening is the curve's way of arriving at near certainty, of approaching a limit that it can approach arbitrarily closely, but not in pure probability terms, actually touch until the absolute certainty of the pigeonhole principle is invoked at 366. But for practical purposes, the curve has done its work by 70 people. At 70, the probability has climbed to approximately 99.9. 0.3% of groups of 70 people will contain no shared birthday. In those rare groups, the mathematics will have distributed all 70 birthdays across the calendar without repetition, a feat about as likely as shuffling a deck of cards into perfect sequential order, possible in theory, vanishingly unlikely in practice. The flattening of the curve is the place where the mathematics settles. It is not a dramatic feature of the graph. It is simply the point at which the curve stops climbing steeply and begins to rest against the ceiling of near certainty, the summit that intuition imagined at 180 people or 200 or anywhere in the upper range of the calendar's capacity has already been reached and passed well before the group has grown large enough to account for most of the calendar's days. And the curve peaks and flattens while most of the year's 365 dates have still not been spoken. While still leaving most of the calendar empty, the mathematics has already arranged to near certainty for at least two of the dates to be shared. There is something in this that feels, once understood, less like a curiosity about probability and more like an observation about connection itself. The world is organized in ways that produce coincidences more readily than intuition predicts. The structure of any discrete finite domain, any system where items are drawn from a limited pool, tends toward overlap and sharing faster than the sense of scale suggests it should. Shared birthdays are the birthday paradox's clearest illustration of this, but the underlying principle reaches further than the calendar. The calendar simply makes the demonstration concrete and portable and something that can be confirmed in a room of 23 people in the time it takes to go around the circle and say a date out loud. The 23 chairs in their loose circle hold 23 folded slips of paper. Somewhere among them, probably, more likely than not, two slips carry the same date. The coincidence is already there. It has been there since the papers were laid down. It requires nothing more than a turning over of slips, a reading aloud of dates, to become known. And when it is found, when two dates match and two voices confirm it, the room will not have changed. The chairs will still be in their circle. The slips will still be pale and rectangular. The only thing that will have changed is that an invisible thread, one of the 253 that have been silently present all along, will have become visible. The mathematics will have been caught doing its ordinary, patient, unsensational work, the slow and inevitable arithmetic of connection. The probability curve rises from a single person, zero chance of sharing with themselves, and climbs through the small group sizes with a steepness that outruns the intuition's model of it, reaching 50% at 23, passing 70% at 30, arriving at 99.9% at 70, and then leveling, flattening, settling into that wide, calm plane that the mathematics reaches so much sooner than expected, so much sooner than the place where the intuition imagined the summit would be. The mathematics has been quietly arranging meetings all along, in every gathering of moderate size, in the conference room, in the classroom, in the modest assembly of any ordinary occasion. It has been doing this same patient work, connecting dates across pairings, accumulating probabilities, pair by pair, arriving at its result before anyone has thought to ask the question. The meetings have been arranged, they simply have not always been noticed. In the administrator's office on Tristan da Cunha, a ledger lies open on a wooden desk. The room is small, its single window facing the settlement of Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, and beyond that window, the South Atlantic stretches away in every direction without interruption, gray-green and enormous. The ledger's pages are ruled in faint blue lines, and down its columns someone has entered, in a careful hand, the names and birth dates of the island's residents across several generations. A finger moving down those columns would pause, and pause again, and pause a third time, finding the same calendar date entered beside three different family surnames. The handwriting changes between entries, one careful and upright, one slightly slanted, one in a darker ink that suggests a different pen and a different decade, but the date does not change. It reappears exactly, the same month and the same number, belonging to people who share neither blood nor name, only the calendar's quiet insistence on repeating itself. Tristan da Cunha holds the distinction of being the world's most remote inhabited island. It sits in the South Atlantic, roughly equidistant from southern Africa and South America, and for most of the 20th century, its population has hovered somewhere between 250 and 300 people. Mail arrives by ship, resupply comes by ship. The population has always been small enough that everyone on the island knows the names of everyone else, and the genealogical records have been kept with the care that isolated communities bring to knowing who they are and where they came from. When researchers examine those records, the concentration of shared birthdays was not evenly distributed across the calendar in the way it might appear in a large open population. Instead, certain dates recurred with a regularity that pointed backward toward the island's origins in the early 19th century, when the founding population numbered fewer than a dozen individuals. That small original group carried with them a narrow slice of the possible genetic range, and the biological and social patterns that shaped when children were born in those first families became the patterns that shaped when children were born in the families that followed. The dates in the ledger are not random, they are echoes. The island's first permanent settler arrived in 1816, and the handful of people who gathered there in the decades that followed, castaways, sailors who stayed, women brought from the island of St. Helena, formed the entire genetic and demographic foundation for the community that exists today. Every person born on Tristan da Cunha in the last 2 centuries descends from that original small group. The island is often described in demographic literature as a natural laboratory, not because anything was done to it artificially, but because its isolation preserved something that larger populations dissolve, the clear, traceable consequence of small beginnings. In a population that large populations dissolve, the birthday patterns that emerge from a founding group simply average out across hundreds of thousands of births. On Tristan da Cunha, there was nowhere for the pattern to average out into. It remained visible, the way a watermark remains visible when the paper is held to light. The administrators who have kept those ledgers over the generations were not thinking about probability when they recorded the entries. They were doing the ordinary work of administration, registering the new people arriving into the world, noting their names and the names of their parents, recording the dates, because dates are what official records require. The repetition accumulated without ceremony. A child born on the same date as a grandparent already entered in the ledger, or as a neighbor in a different row of the register, was simply another entry in the usual format. The pattern was visible in the record, but no one needed to remark on it, because on an island that small, almost everything that happens connects to something that happened before. The ledger was just one more place where connection was quietly legible. Far from Tristan da Cunha, on a different kind of southern continent, a small municipality in the Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul has accumulated its own unusual demographic record. Cândido Godai sits in a region of rolling hills settled largely by German immigrants and their descendants, and its size is modest enough that the parish registers have functioned as its primary demographic record across many generations. The twin birth rate in Cândido Godai runs at approximately 18 sets of twins per 1,000 births. The global average is roughly 12. That gap is not enormous in absolute terms, but it is consistent enough and has persisted across enough decades that researchers have examined it carefully. Geneticist Enio Novello and other investigators found a combination of genetic and possible environmental factors contributing to the elevated rate, and the inherited consequence of a founding population whose particular biological characteristics carried forward into a community that remained relatively closed for generations. Within that already elevated twin rate, researchers documented an additional pattern, a clustering of twin birth dates around specific calendar periods. The parish register was not simply showing more twins than average. It was showing twins arriving in concentrations at particular times of year, in a way the wider research literature on twin births had not fully anticipated. The main street of Cundy do Godoy on a school morning is an ordinary street in a small Brazilian municipality. There are low buildings, a church whose record books run back through a century and a half of local history, and children walking to school in the unhurried way of children who know everyone they are likely to see. What is not visible on the surface of an ordinary morning is the demographic record written into the generations of the community, the genetic inheritance of the families that founded the town, and the particular way that inheritance has expressed itself in the timing of births. Twins pass each other on that street without comment, because twins are common enough in Cundy do Godoy to pass unremarked. That ordinariness is itself the record. The unusual thing has been absorbed so thoroughly into daily life that it no longer registers as unusual to the people living inside it. The parish register holds the numbers. The street holds the people. Moving north and west to a very different landscape, the small agricultural community of Planada sits in California's Merced County, beset into the flat expanse of the San Joaquin Valley, where the summer heat arrives early and stays long, and the agricultural calendar shapes the rhythms of daily life in ways that are visible in nearly every aspect of the community's history. Planada is an agricultural town, and its founding population arrived as part of the seasonal migration patterns of the agricultural workers who came to the valley to harvest particular crops at particular times of year. Local historians examining the community's birth records found a disproportionate number of residents born in the late summer months, a clustering that pointed back to the seasonal patterns of conception that had prevailed among the community's founding families. Those families arrived and stayed when the agricultural calendar brought them there. They formed households and families in the rhythms that the farming season permitted, and the births that followed reflected those rhythms in the way that birth records almost always reflect. When examined closely, the social and economic patterns of the families that produced them. The late summer births in Planada are not mysterious. They are legible, the way a watermark is legible. Once someone holds the paper to light, the pattern is simply there. There is something particular about the way agricultural communities carry their founding patterns forward. The crop does not negotiate with the calendar. The harvest arrives when it arrives. The families who built their lives around those harvests organized their years in response to the harvest demands, and the births that came 9 months after the quieter periods of that organization landed in the same windows, year after year, generation after generation, until the seasonal clustering became a feature of the community's demographic record. Regional historians reading those records can trace the founding family's origins not only in surnames and property records, but in the months when their descendants arrived into the world. The calendar kept a record of the harvest as surely as the granary ledgers did, though in a different kind of column. The crew manifest of the USS Indianapolis is a different kind of record. It is a naval document, not a ledger of births in an isolated island community or a parish register in a small Brazilian town. The Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser that was sunk in July 1945, and its history belongs to the larger record of the Second World War in the Pacific. Among the approximately 1,196 crew members listed in that manifest, naval historians examining the records found at least 3 pairs of crewmen who shared exact birth dates. That is not a striking result in isolation. For a group of that size, the birthday paradox predicts a very high probability of multiple shared birthdays, and 3 pairs of matching dates is consistent with what the mathematics would anticipate. What makes it worth noting is not that the coincidence was remarkable, it is that the coincidence was unremarkable, entirely predicted, entirely consistent with theoretical probability, the expected output of a large enough roster of people. The manifest was not assembled to produce birthday pairs. It was assembled by the operational requirements of a warship. The shared birthdays arrived as a statistical consequence, unnoticed and unrecorded at the time, waiting for a later examination to bring them into focus. The naval archivist's work of moving through a crew manifest is the kind of slow, detailed research that most people never have reason to do. A finger runs down a column of birth dates, an entry from Ohio, one from South Carolina, one from Illinois, and the individual entries accumulate into a roster that is also, quietly, a demographic document. The archivist pauses where dates repeat. The first pause is unremarkable. The second pause brings a small specific focus. By the third pause, the mathematics has made itself visible in the document, and the archivist notes the confirmation of what the probability predicted, that in a group of nearly 1,200 people, shared birthdays were not an outcome that required extraordinary explanation. They were, from the beginning, a near certainty waiting to be confirmed. It is worth following that observation a little further, because the Indianapolis Manifest illustrates something that holds true for any roster of comparable size: a military unit, a large corporate directory, the enrollment records of a mid-sized university. Any document listing the birth dates of roughly 1,000 people will contain multiple pairs of matching dates, and the person running a finger down that list will pause more often than intuition predicts. The mathematics that produces this result is not particular to any one group of people or any one institution. It operates without preference across any collection of birth dates large enough for the pairing probability to become substantial. The archivist finding 3 matched pairs in the Indianapolis roster was finding the predicted consequence of the roster's size, not an anomaly within it. Pitcairn Island's birth registry operates at the opposite end of the demographic scale from a naval vessel's crew manifest. Pitcairn is one of the least populated jurisdictions on Earth, a small volcanic island in the southern Pacific Ocean whose entire resident population at any given moment in recent decades has numbered in the dozens. The island was settled in 1790 by the mutineers from the HMS Bounty and the Tahitian men and women who accompanied them, 9 mutineers in total, along with a small number of Tahitian companions, and every person born on Pitcairn since that settling descends from that original group. The birth registry kept on the island since the early 19th century shows the consequence of that narrow origin across generations with a clarity that larger populations never achieve. Open the registry to any given decade, and the same small constellation of dates appears and reappears, not because any particular date was chosen by the founding settlers, but because the biological and social patterns of 9 original individuals, repeated and amplified across generations in a population with essentially no outside genetic input, have left a record in the calendar as persistent as any family name. The Bounty's mutineers have been examined in many historical and literary contexts. Their story has become one of the better-known episodes of 18th century seafaring, and the island they settled has been described in countless books and accounts. What those accounts do not always dwell on is the demographic consequence of a founding population of 9 people establishing a community that has remained by geography and preference largely closed to outside settlement for over 2 centuries. That demographic consequence is legible in the birth registry. The dates that repeat across Pitcairn's records are not dates chosen or celebrated for any particular reason. They are the ghost of the original 9, the statistical trace of a very small beginning, propagating through time in a population too small to dilute it. Any document that records births on Pitcairn across several decades becomes inadvertently a kind of genealogical argument. The recurring dates are not proof of any single cause. They reflect the layered interaction of the island's small gene pool, its particular social patterns, the biological rhythms that prevailed among the founding families, and that their descendants inherited in one form or another, and the simple mathematical consequence of a small enough population to make coincidences visible. On a larger island, with a larger population, those same patterns would dissolve into a broader distribution and become statistically invisible. On Pitcairn, they remain at the surface, a permanent feature of the record. There is a quality to very small, very isolated communities that makes them different from larger populations in ways that go beyond mere size. The isolation is not simply physical, though the physical isolation of Tristan da Cunha and Pitcairn Island is as complete as any inhabited place on Earth offers. It is also a kind of temporal isolation, a slowing of the ordinary rate at which populations exchange genetic and cultural material with their neighbors, the process by which patterns are introduced, mixed, and eventually smoothed into the background of a large and varied demographic record. When that exchange slows or stops entirely, the founding patterns do not smooth. They deepen. The same dates appear in the ledger, not once but repeatedly, generation after generation, until the calendar itself seems to be making an argument about where these people came from and how they are connected to each other. The genealogical records of these communities are not kept as demonstrations of any mathematical principle. They are kept because communities keep records of the people in them, and because knowing who was born and when is among the most fundamental pieces of information a community holds about itself. The administrators, parish priests, and record keepers who filled those columns over generations were doing ordinary work. The patterns they recorded were ordinary patterns, visible to anyone who looked carefully, but not remarkable enough to draw attention in the daily operation of a small island or a small town. It is only when someone examines the record at a certain distance, holding it up against the broader context of what probability predicts for populations of these sizes, that the pattern becomes specifically interesting rather than merely local. The founding population question, how the demographic character of an original small group propagates through the generations that follow, appears across many different kinds of communities and in many different historical contexts. It appears in the records of religious communities that settled in geographic isolation, in the birth registries of island populations throughout the Pacific and Atlantic, in the demographic histories of communities formed by migration waves that deposited particular groups in particular places and left them to establish their own patterns without much subsequent contact with the larger populations from which they came. In each case, the record of births over time carries the founding group's characteristics forward in ways that are often still legible a century or more later. The birthday clustering in these records is only one form that propagation takes, and not always the most prominent form, but it is among the most quietly consistent. A birth date is a small piece of information. It fits in a single column of a ledger. It requires no more space than a name, and in official records, it usually gets no more ceremony than a name does. Yet the accumulation of birth dates across generations in a small, isolated community creates a document of unusual specificity, a record not only of when particular individuals arrived in the world, but of the deep structural patterns that shaped those arrivals, reaching back through the biology and social organization of the people who came before. The ledger on the administrator's desk in Edinburgh of the Seven Seas holds in its ruled columns the consequence of a handful of 19th century arrivals whose biological patterns became over generations the patterns of the entire population. The same is true of the parish register in Candido Godoy, the birth records in Planada, the crew manifest of the Indianapolis, though the Indianapolis roster captures the mathematics from a different angle, the mathematics of a large and varied group rather than a small and persistent one, and the registry on Pitcairn. These are not the only places where the calendar has accumulated shared dates in ways that point to a specific history. Agricultural communities throughout the world, island populations throughout the Pacific and the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, military rosters, the membership rolls of religious communities that settled in geographic and social isolation, all of them carry in their birth records the legible trace of how their founders organized their lives, and when, as a consequence of that organization, their children arrived. The birthday patterns in these records are not decorations, they are evidence. Evidence of origin, of social organization, of biological inheritance, of the particular conditions under which a community first established itself, and the degree to which those conditions persisted across time. What the records of Tristan da Cunha and Pitcairn and Candido Godoy share across their obvious differences in location and culture and history is the way they make visible something that larger populations keep hidden by sheer scale. In a city of millions, the founding patterns of the people who first settled the place are long since dissolved into the demographic variety of 10,000 subsequent arrivals. The birthday clustering that might have been legible in the first generation has been absorbed into a distribution broad enough that no particular date stands out. But in the small, isolated community, the founding pattern has nowhere to go. It circles back through the generations the way the same names circle through a family tree, appearing in new individuals, new entries in the ledger, new rows below the rows that came before. The handwriting in the Tristan da Cunha ledger changes with each administrator, each generation. The pen is different. The ink is sometimes darker, sometimes lighter. The names in the left column shift from one family to another, and the occupations and addresses in the adjacent columns reflect the changes a community undergoes across a century and more of continuous habitation. Only the dates remain constant in their repetition, reappearing across surnames, across decades, across the different hands of different administrators, doing the same ordinary work of recording who arrived and when. That constancy is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It sits in the column where dates sit, doing what dates do, marking a point in the year's rotation, distinguishing one moment from the others that surround it, accumulating across the ledger's pages into a pattern that is, once noticed, entirely unsurprising, the patient, quiet arithmetic of a small population repeating itself across time. The Pitcairn Island Birth Registry rests open on a table, its pages carrying the same small constellation of dates across decade after decade. The entries continue their silent work of connection, each one placing a person at a point in the calendar, each recurring date linking that person backward to someone else, placed at the same point in an earlier year. The island's population is small enough now that the connections are mostly known to the people who carry them, Everyone on Pitcairn knows, in the way that small communities always know, which dates recur and whose histories they belong to. The registry makes that knowledge official, sets it in columns, preserves it in ink that will outlast the individuals it describes. Long after the particular people whose births are recorded have passed from living memory, the dates they share will remain on the page, pointing quietly back toward the 9 people who first settled the island and whose patterns have been repeating in different individuals and different hands and different decades ever since. Small beginnings leave long echoes. The mathematics of shared birthdays is sometimes just the shape of a founding family spreading across time, their patterns becoming the community's patterns, their calendar becoming the community's calendar. The dates they happen to arrive, repeating in their children's children, the way a word repeated enough times becomes simply the name for the thing it describes. A maternity ward record book for September lies open on a wooden desk, its columns filled in with small, careful numerals. The daily tallies climb higher than they do in almost any other month. They have climbed this way in this same ward and in wards like it across the country for as long as the records have been kept. Nothing about the page looks unusual to the administrator who fills it in each morning, because the pattern is simply how September is busy, full, the hallways carrying a particular low hum that the staff associate with this time of year, without necessarily having a name for why it arrives when it does. To find where that quiet surplus of September birthdays began, it helps to turn the calendar backward. Not by a week, not by a month, by 9. The page lands in December, in the middle of the holiday period, in the middle of the warmth and proximity and extended time that December arranges for people in a way that most other months do not. The arithmetic is unhurried and patient. What happens in December resolves 9 months later as the particular weight of a September ward. The record book does not say this anywhere, but the numbers carry the information anyway, in the patient language of accumulated days. A comprehensive analysis published in the journal PLOS One in 2013 examined birth records from 130 countries, and what it found was this: virtually every human population, regardless of geography, regardless of culture, regardless of climate, shows some degree of clustering in the months when its births occur. The peak month shifts considerably from one region to another. It follows latitude. It follows the calendar of local festivals and rest periods and agricultural seasons. But the clustering itself is essentially universal. Some months in every studied country receive more births than the mathematics of pure chance would predict, and other months receive fewer. The year, it turns out, is not a flat surface across which births are evenly spread. It has contours. It has low places and high places, and those contours are not random. In the United States, the high place is September. Data compiled by the National Center for Health Statistics across several decades identifies September as the month with the highest average number of daily births in the country, and within September at a single date, the 9th has appeared in multiple analyses as statistically the most common birthday in the country. The 9th of September is not special in the way that a holiday is special. Nothing is celebrated on that date. No cultural event clusters there. What clusters there is the downstream consequence of something that happened roughly 9 months earlier, in the warmth of the Christmas and New Year's period, in the particular conditions that the late December holiday creates, and that the calendar then carries forward, invisibly, through the months that follow. Researchers in reproductive epidemiology have examined the holiday conception effect in several countries, and the pattern holds across different contexts and different cultures. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia, countries with different climates and different cultural traditions, but all sharing an extended end-of-year holiday period. There is a statistically significant increase in births occurring approximately 9 months after Christmas and New Year's. The effect is not modest. It is large enough to appear clearly in national birth statistics, large enough to shape the character of hospital wards in September and to influence the demographic composition of school cohorts born in that month. And the effect is strongest in countries where the holiday period involves the longest uninterrupted closures of workplaces and schools, where ordinary life is most thoroughly suspended, and people are simply more together and more at rest than they usually are. This is not a mysterious finding, and it does not require a complicated explanation. What the holiday period produces is proximity and leisure, and a particular quality of warmth that differs from the warmth of ordinary evenings. Extended closures of the ordinary structures of daily life place people in each other's company for longer than routine allows. The social distances that work schedules and weekday obligations maintain are for a week or two contracted, and what follows 9 months later in the records of maternity wards in September is the quiet, legible trace of that contraction. The record book on the administrator's desk does not know any of this. It only knows that the 9th column is full. The holiday effect is one thread. There is another one running alongside it, slower and older, and it has to do not with the social calendar, but with the biological one. The human body does not experience the 12 months of the year as equivalent. It responds to them. It adjusts its chemistry in response to how much light fills each day, and to the temperature of the air, and to signals from the environment that are so gradual and so constant that they operate below the threshold of anything that could be called awareness. The response is real, and it is measurable, and it is old in the way that the relationship between a body and the world it evolved inside is old, which is to say very old, and not fully separable from the conditions that made the body possible in the first place. Deep inside the human brain, near the center, there is a structure the size of a grain of rice. It sits behind the eyes and between the two hemispheres, in a recess so sheltered that early anatomists believed it must serve some particularly protected function. The pineal gland, as it came to be known, produces melatonin, a hormone whose secretion rises and falls in response to the presence and absence of light, rising as darkness accumulates and falling as light returns. In the long evenings of winter, when the days shorten and the nights lengthen, melatonin output climbs. In summer, it falls. The gland is, in the most literal sense, a biological clock calibrated to the turning of the year, adjusting its output in slow response to a signal it never stops reading, the duration of each day's light. Melatonin does not act in isolation. Its rhythms are entangled with those of other hormones, including those that govern reproductive timing. Researchers in reproductive science have established that photoperiod, the technical term for the daily duration of light exposure, influences human fertility through its effects on melatonin and on the hormones whose timing melatonin helps regulate. The relationship is not as stark in humans as it is in some other mammals. Sheep and deer, for instance, are strongly seasonal breeders whose fertility windows are almost entirely governed by day length. In humans, the effect is softer, more easily overridden by social and cultural factors, but it remains present in the data when you look at populations large enough to smooth out the noise of individual variation. The pineal gland is still reading the light. The body is still listening to the year. Testosterone levels in men show a seasonal pattern, with studies reporting modest but consistent peaks in autumn months and corresponding dips in summer. Ovulation timing in women shows seasonal variation as well, with some research suggesting a slight shift in the distribution of ovulatory events across the year in populations living at higher latitudes, where the contrast between long summer days and short winter ones is most pronounced. These are not large effects when considered at the scale of a single person's life, but at the scale of a country's birth records, aggregated across millions of people over decades. They are large enough to leave a mark, a soft but readable signal in the data that the body has been attending to the year all along. Sperm quality is one of the more carefully studied dimensions of this seasonal biology. A study published in the journal Human Reproduction examined multiple parameters of sperm function across the seasons and found that both motility, the ability of sperm to move efficiently, and morphology, the proportion of normally shaped sperm cells in a sample, were measurably lower during periods of high ambient temperature. The warm months of the year are not the most favorable conditions for sperm production and function, and this is reflected in the data with enough consistency that the pattern has been replicated across several research groups and in populations in different climatic regions. The body keeps its own accounting of the temperature outside. It adjusts accordingly. 9 months downstream, in maternity ward record books, the adjustment becomes legible. At high latitudes, the seasonal signal is sharpest. A graph of daylight duration in Reykjavik across the 12 months of the year is a dramatic document. In June, the sun barely sets, and the days hold more light than most people who have not experienced it can easily imagine. In December, the daylight window narrows to a few hours, and the quality of those hours is low and oblique, the sun moving through a shallow arc just above the southern horizon. The corresponding fertility data for populations at these latitudes moves in counterpoint to the light curve, not perfectly, not with the mechanical precision of a tide chart, but with the kind of general correspondence that tells researchers something real is being tracked. The body at high latitude is more responsive to the seasonal signal because the seasonal signal is louder. The pineal gland is receiving more extreme instructions, and the downstream effects are more visible in the statistics that follow. In Reykjavik, birth data shows a pronounced seasonal pattern, with the spring months, particularly April and May, receiving a disproportionate share of annual births. That spring peak traces back 9 months to the late summer and early autumn, to the months when days are still long and the light is only beginning its retreat. The biology of high-latitude reproduction has had a long time to calibrate to this pattern. The reproductive system does not have intentions, but it has history, and the history it carries is one in which the timing of conception has always mattered to the health of what follows, and the body has always had access to a calendar, even when no calendar was visible on any wall. The seasonal clustering of births produces as a quiet side effect the clustering of birthdays. This is how the birthday paradox, the mathematics of shared dates in a group, acquires a biological dimension that the pure probability calculation does not contain. The calculation assumes birthdays are distributed evenly across the year, 1/365th chance for each date, equal in all directions. But birthdays are not distributed evenly. September has more of them in the United States. April and May have more of them in Iceland. Late winter has more of them in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where a different seasonal fertility peak applies. The actual distribution is uneven in ways that vary by population and by latitude, and by the specific cultural calendar of a given society. And the effect of this unevenness, when applied to the birthday paradox calculation, is to make shared birthdays even more probable than the standard formula predicts. When births cluster, the target dates become more crowded, and the odds of two people landing on the same one improve accordingly. In the United States, if a group of 23 people is assembled, and the assumption is made that birthdays are evenly distributed across all 365 dates, the probability of a shared birthday in that group exceeds 50%. But if the group is assembled from a population where September birthdays are more common, drawn, say, from a school class whose members were born predominantly in the same year and in the same country, the uneven distribution of birthdays towards September slightly increases the probability further. The pure mathematical result is already, in its way, a lower bound. The actual biology pushes it a little higher. The coincidence, wherever it occurs, is at least as inevitable as the formula suggests, and in practice often more so. This is a detail that tends to sit quietly in the research literature without attracting much attention, partly because the adjustment it requires to the standard birthday paradox calculation is small, and partly because the pure result is already counterintuitive enough to make the additional nuance feel like a footnote. The footnote is nevertheless real. The body's response to the turning year is one of the forces that shapes the distribution of birthdays in any population, and that distribution is one of the forces that shapes the probability of shared birthdays in any room. The seasonal biology of reproduction is not separate from the mathematics of coincidence. It feeds into it at the level of the individual body 9 months before the birthday is even established. The holiday effect and the photoperiod effect are not the same phenomenon, though they run in the same direction during the winter months and can be difficult to separate in the data. The holiday effect is social. It is produced by the structure of the cultural calendar, by the timing of institutional closures and collective rest. The photoperiod effect is biological. It is produced by the length of the day, acting on hormone levels, acting on reproductive timing. Both effects produce elevated birth rates in certain months. Both effects produce clustering. Whether a particular September birthday is more directly attributable to a December holiday gathering or to the slow hormonal adjustments of a shortening November is not a question the record book can answer. The body does not file separate reports for social causes and biological ones. It simply produces the outcome, and the outcome settles into the maternity ward tally for the month. What researchers have attempted in studying populations with very different cultural calendars is to pull these two threads apart enough to examine each one separately. Populations that do not observe the December holiday period in the same way as the United States or the United Kingdom show different seasonal birth patterns, but they still show seasonal birth patterns. This is consistent with a photoperiod effect operating independently of the cultural calendar, the biology running underneath the culture, producing its own soft clustering that the culture then modifies but does not eliminate. And populations at very low latitudes, where the day length varies only slightly across the year, tend to show weaker seasonal birth clustering than populations at higher latitudes, which is also consistent with a photoperiod story. The signal follows the light. The biology is doing what it has always done. The Bavarian data offers one of the more specific examples of a cultural event leaving a legible mark on birth records. Epidemiologists examining regional hospital statistics found a measurable elevation in births approximately 9 months after Oktoberfest, the annual festival held in Munich each autumn, one of the largest gatherings of people in prolonged warm social proximity to be found anywhere on the calendar. The effect is not enormous. It is not so large that it would be obvious to anyone walking through a Munich maternity ward in late June or July without access to the historical baseline, but it is statistically present, and it has been noted in the academic literature as a contribution to the understanding of how large communal gatherings function as regional fertility timing mechanisms. A festival is, among other things, a temporary rearrangement of the social world, an occasion when the ordinary distances between people contract, when proximity is extended, when the conditions for certain kinds of human contact are more available than they usually are. The birth records, 9 months downstream, carry that information. Munich in late September smells of barley and wood smoke and the particular closeness of large crowds in autumn air. The tents hold thousands of people at a time, in noise and warmth, in the kind of prolonged togetherness that daily urban life rarely arranges. The festival runs for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks a particular density of human warmth is maintained that is different from the warmth of ordinary days. What the birth records then show, 9 months later, that faint but legible elevation in the late June and early July tallies, is the trace of that density, written into the demographic record of the region in the only language such records possess. The quiet accumulation of numbers that are slightly higher than the baseline would predict. The Rio de Janeiro data tells a similar story, or a version of one. Researchers examining hospital birth records in Rio de Janeiro and in Salvador found modest but statistically notable elevations in births approximately 9 months after Carnival, the extended festival that reorganizes the social life of those cities for several days in late February or early March each year. The effect is, if anything, more culturally concentrated than the Bavarian one, because Carnival in Brazil is a more total social disruption, a more complete rearrangement of ordinary daily structure, and because the cities involved are more sharply divided by neighborhood and community in ways that make the signal from any given district more interpretable. The pattern in the data is not definitive, and the researchers who reported it framed it carefully as a modest and suggestive result rather than a firm conclusion. But the direction of the effect is consistent with the rest of the literature: large gatherings, extended proximity, the suspension of ordinary routine, and then, 9 months later, a small rise in the birth tallies. There is something worth sitting with in this, in the way that the energy of a festival translates into the demographics of a city 9 months later, not as a moral observation and not with any particular emphasis, simply as a fact about how human social life and human biology are entangled, how the calendar of communal celebration leaves a mark in the calendar of communal birth, how the two are not separate registers, but continuous ones, each feeding into the other in slow cycles that the record books document without comment. A festival is a moment of heightened social presence. A birth record is a document of biological consequence. Between those two things lies the biology of the body, attending to the social conditions it finds itself in, adjusting its timing and response, and eventually producing an outcome that shows up, months later, as a number slightly larger than expected in a particular column of a particular ward's tally. The research on seasonal fertility has in recent decades grown into a substantial field, with studies covering not just birth records, but also hormonal assays, epidemiological surveys, and comparisons across populations in different climatic zones. The field has its complexities and its ongoing debates. The relative contribution of the photoperiod effect versus the holiday effect versus other social and cultural variables is not fully settled, and different researchers weight these factors differently. What is not debated is the underlying phenomenon itself. Seasonal birth clustering is real. It is present in virtually every studied population, and it has been operating as long as humans have been having children, in a world organized by seasons, which is to say, for the entire span of human existence. One of the interesting complications in the research is that the seasonal pattern of births has been changing in some populations over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. The advent of artificial light, of climate control, of work schedules that no longer follow agricultural rhythms, these have, in some populations, muted the seasonal signal. The photoperiod effect is partly dependent on the body's ability to read the natural light environment, and artificial light interferes with that reading in ways that researchers are still working to understand. In some studies, populations with higher exposure to artificial light at night show flatter birth seasonality curves, suggesting that the melatonin signal has been partially disrupted by the electrical illumination that now fills most modern nights. The pineal gland is still there, still the size of a grain of rice, still secreting melatonin in response to darkness, but the darkness is not as dark as it used to be, and the signal it sends is not as clean. In a city lit through the night, the pineal gland receives instructions that differ from the ones received by any human body that lived before the 20th century. The deep dark of a December night, which would once have told the body clearly that it was deep winter and adjusted the body's hormonal rhythms accordingly, is now a partially illuminated dark, interrupted by streetlights and screens, and the ambient glow of a city that does not fully stop. The seasonal biology is reading a modified text. What it makes of the modifications is part of what the current research is trying to understand, not as an alarm, but as a question about what happens to an ancient calibration when the environment it was calibrated to begins to change. The fact that the seasonal pattern is partly biological and partly social means that it is also, in part, historical. The birth seasonality of a population at any given moment is a record of the conditions that shaped reproduction in that population over time. The agricultural calendar that once organized work and rest, the religious calendar that organized festival and observance, the latitude and climate that organized light and dark. A September peak in American birth statistics carries the echo of holiday gatherings. Yes, but it also carries the residue of older patterns, older rhythms, older calibrations between the human body and the year that predate any modern cultural calendar by a very long time. When researchers trace the seasonal birth peaks of populations that have shifted their way of life significantly over the course of a few generations, populations that have moved from agricultural to urban settings, from low latitude to high latitude environments, from traditional calendars to modern ones, they find that the birth seasonality curves shift too, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly, tracking the new conditions with a lag that reflects the time it takes for biological patterns to adjust to social change. The body does not change as quickly as the calendar does. The photoperiod signal is still arriving. The hormonal adjustments are still being made. The birth records, when examined carefully, show a curve that is partly present and partly past, partly the product of current conditions, and partly the echo of older ones. A maternity ward in September is a consequence of many things. It is a consequence of the holiday gatherings of the previous December, when the cultural calendar arranged for people to be warm and together. It is a consequence of the shortened days of November, when melatonin rose in the brain's small central gland and adjusted the hormonal environment in ways too slow and too diffuse to be noticed by anyone. They occurred inside. It is a consequence of agricultural patterns that no longer exist, but whose timing shaped the fertility calendars of founding populations, whose descendants still carry the demographic echo of those rhythms. It is a consequence of the way warmth and proximity have always been entangled with the biology of reproduction across species and across millennia in the long continuous negotiation between the body and the conditions it finds itself in. The administrator filling in the September tally does not need to know any of this. The numbers are the numbers. The ward is full because it is full in the way it is always full in September, in the way it will presumably be full again next September, following a pattern so consistent that it has become simply a feature of the year, unremarkable except to researchers who look for it deliberately and find in its consistency the outlines of something old and interesting and continuous. Outside the ward, in the city, in the houses and apartments and all the places where December evenings were spent in warmth and proximity 9 months ago, nothing marks the connection between that time and this one. The people who were gathered then are gathered elsewhere now. The holiday is 9 months past. The body has already done what it did, in the slow hormonal language of the pineal gland, and the seasonal shifts in sperm quality, and the slight variations in ovulation timing that show up in population data without appearing in any individual's awareness. The biological event has concluded. Its consequence is here, in the ward, in the September tally, in the quiet surplus of names being entered into the record with careful numerals, and somewhere in that surplus, in the particular density of birthdays that September carries compared to every other month, the birthday paradox quietly does its work. The shared dates that mathematics predicts will appear in groups of 23 or 30 or 70. Those shared dates are more probable here than the formula alone would suggest, because the formula assumes a flatness that the biology does not produce. September is a crowded month. The dates within it carry more people than they would if the year were level. The coincidences that arise when September children are gathered together have biology behind them, as well as mathematics, the pineal gland behind them, as well as the probability curve, the shortening afternoon behind them, as well as the 253 pairings among 23 people in a room. The pineal gland does not know this. It does not know anything in the way that knowing requires a mind to hold a thought. It is a grain of rice structure in a warm, dark interior, receiving light information through neural pathways from the eyes, adjusting its melatonin output in response, contributing its small signal to the larger hormonal conversation the body conducts with the year. The adjustment it makes in a November afternoon, as the light fails earlier than it did in October and earlier than it will in March, is not felt by the person it occurs inside. There is no sensation of the melatonin rising. There is no awareness of the slow hormonal shift that will, months from now, contribute to whether a conception occurs and when. The gland simply does what it does, in the dark, in response to the year, as it has always done. What that adjustment eventually becomes, when it resolves into a changed probability, into a conception in December, into a birth in September, into a name in the administrator's record book, into a birthday shared with the person in the next row of the classroom, is the outcome of a process so distributed across time and space, and biology and culture, that no single cause can claim credit for it. The holiday gathering contributed. The shortened day contributed. The agricultural history of the founding families contributed. The particular structure of the cultural calendar contributed. The probability mathematics contributed. All of these arrived together at the single specific outcome, a birthday, a shared birthday, a coincidence that was not really a coincidence in the way that word usually implies, but was instead the predictable downstream consequence of forces that had been operating all year, in the light and the dark, and the warmth and the long biological conversation between the body and the turning world. The pineal gland, still there in its recess, is responding right now to a shortening autumn afternoon, the days declining toward their minimum, the melatonin rising in a slow tide through the bodies of everyone who lives under this sky. The signal will continue to build through December. Some of what it produces will be invisible and will remain so. Some of it will eventually become a number in a September record book, a birthday in a room full of birthdays, one slip of paper among 23 slips that have already, before anyone has turned them over, arranged themselves into more pairs than the room suspects. The year is always doing this. The light is always shortening and lengthening, the melatonin always adjusting, the body always listening to the calendar it was built inside. September follows December, the way the tide follows the moon, that cannot be seen from the shore, not because the connection is visible from any one point, but because it has always been there, working through the long interval between cause and consequence, patient and consistent, in the body's own slow time. Ink drying on a page is a quiet thing. The moment just after the quill lifts, when the letters are still slightly wet and the words have not yet settled into permanence, that pause belongs to the writer alone, and then it belongs to whoever reads them next. On one particular evening at Versailles, in the winter of a year when the court's social machinery was running at its usual careful speed, a secretary or a diarist set down two names side by side on the same line, between them a date, the same date, written once, belonging to both. The ink dried, the discovery moved. It did not move loudly. The court of Louis XIV was not a place where small personal facts announced themselves in open rooms. It moved the way useful information always moves in a world organized around patronage and alliance passed in the margins of a conversation, noted in a private journal, carried by someone who understood that a shared birthday, when read through the astrology the court took seriously, meant a shared celestial influence, and that a shared celestial influence was a kind of bond, and that a bond was a resource. The diary entry was small. The mark of significance beside it was small, but the discovery had found its place in the accounting that courtiers kept of one another, and it would stay there. The court astrologers maintained detailed records for every member of the royal household, cataloging birth dates, birth hours, and the planetary configurations that attended each arrival into the world. When a shared birthday emerged from those records, it was not treated as a curiosity or a mathematical oddity. It was treated as information, the kind that might be acted on, or at least held in reserve. Two courtiers born under the same sky, in the astrological understanding of the time, carried something of the same nature. That was not a trivial observation in a world where the texture of a person's character was believed to be legible in the positions of planets at their birth. What is recorded in those court diaries is not the content of any particular belief, but the fact of its presence in the social life of the court. Shared birthdays were noted. They were used. They generated a small charge of meaning in a world organized around the production and expenditure of meaning. Whether the astrological framework was accurate or not does not change what the practice reveals, which is that even in one of the most elaborately hierarchical environments human beings have ever constructed, a shared date of birth was recognized as something worth finding, a point of contact between two people who might otherwise have had none. That instinct, the impulse to find something significant in the fact of a shared birthday, appears in many different forms across many different times and places, and it does not require the specific machinery of court astrology to operate. It seems to arrive wherever people live closely enough together that birthdays become knowable, and wherever the calendar has been given enough importance to make a repeated date feel like a pattern rather than an accident. Among the most carefully documented instances of this instinct operating in a non-European context is the work of the anthropologists Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, who conducted fieldwork in Bali during the 1930s and recorded in considerable detail the ceremonial life of the communities they studied. The Balinese Pawukan calendar is a 210-day cycle, not a solar year, not a lunar year, but a cycle of its own with its own internal logic, running continuously without interruption, each of its days carrying a specific ceremonial identity. A person born on a particular day in the Pawukan cycle shares that ceremonial identity with everyone else born on that same day, across whatever distances of family or village might otherwise separate them. The celebrations that Mead and Bateson documented for people sharing a Pawukan birthday are communal in a way that has no direct equivalent in the Western birthday tradition. The occasion belongs not to a single person, but to the day itself, and everyone the day has claimed gathers to observe it together. They may share no blood, they may live in different parts of the village or in different villages. What they share is a position in the turning of the ceremonial year, and in the Balinese framework documented by those anthropologists, that position is real and consequential, a genuine feature of a person's identity, not a coincidence to be remarked on and set aside. A Balinese village courtyard in the early morning, before the heat has gathered, with the sound of gamelan beginning, the metallophones sending their particular resonance across the compound, and a group of people assembling who share nothing obvious but the day that formed them. They arrive from different directions. The 210-day cycle has turned, and the day has come back, and the day belongs to all of them equally. The ceremony is not organized around one person at its center and others gathered at the edges. It radiates differently. It belongs to a date more than to any individual, and the people the date has accumulated over the years fill the courtyard with what Mead and Bateson recorded as a particular quality of collective acknowledgement, the sense of being part of something that the calendar keeps returning to, that the calendar keeps finding worth marking again. There is something worth sitting with in the difference between a birthday understood as an individual possession and a birthday understood as a shared ceremonial date. The Western tradition, particularly as it developed through the 19th and 20th centuries, moved steadily toward the former. A birthday became more and more thoroughly a person's own. The cake, the candles arranged by number, the guests gathered to focus their attention on a single honoree. The Pawukan model, documented in Bali, operates on a different premise entirely. The date is primary. The people it has collected over the years of the cycle are its expression. The celebration is a gathering of the date's constituents rather than a focusing of attention on any one of them. Both are human responses to the same underlying fact, which is that birthdays repeat and that the repetition creates a kind of community, whether or not anyone decides to act on it. The Balinese ceremonial structure made that community explicit and gave it form. The Versailles court used the shared date as a resource within its existing social architecture. And in the Lutheran parishes of rural Germany, separated from Bali by everything except the basic human situation of people living near enough to each other to know when their neighbors were born, a different solution arrived at a similar destination. The church records from 18th century Württemberg contain a practice that appears with enough consistency across multiple parishes to be recognizable as a regional tradition rather than the invention of a particular pastor. The records show combined birthday celebrations, not for individual parishioners, but for all those born within a given month. The congregation would gather. The pastor would read the names of the month's birth, born from the church register, and what followed was a celebration that belonged to 4 people, or 6 or 8, rather than to one. The tables in the parish hall were set for a shared occasion. The warmth was collective. Historically Lutheran communities in Württemberg were tight enough that everyone knew approximately when everyone else had been born. The church register was the public record. The births, deaths, and marriages were noted there with the careful regularity of an institution that understood its records as permanent. In a community of that size, where a single calendar month might contain only a handful of birthdays, the monthly collective celebration was a solution to an arithmetic problem as much as a spiritual one. Celebrating each birthday individually would require constant interruption of the agricultural year's rhythms. Gathering the month's birthdays into a single occasion gave the celebration weight and made the warmth easier to sustain. What the parish hall contained on those evenings was something specific and recognizable, even at this distance. The names read from the register, Heinrich, Maria, Johann, Katharina, placed together in the pastor's mouth, acknowledged together by the congregation, belonged to people who would carry that shared month in common for the rest of their lives. They had not chosen to be born in the same month. The harvest season, or the winter evenings, or the particular rhythms of that community's year had arranged it. The parish hall made a ceremony out of what the calendar had arranged, and the ceremony gave the coincidence the texture of something intended. This is the pattern that keeps appearing across settings as different from each other as Versailles and a Württemberg parish hall and a Balinese village courtyard. The shared birthday exists before anyone decides what to do with it. The calendar creates it without effort or announcement. And then people finding it consistently treat it as something worth marking. They build around it. They bring it into their ceremonies and their social machinery and their genealogical records. The instinct to find the shared date and make something of it seems to be in the documentary record, quite persistent across time and culture and the enormous variety of human arrangements. The United States Marine Corps has observed its institutional birthday on November 10th every year since the tradition was formalized in the 1920s. The date marks the founding of the Corps in 1775, and the observation has, over the decades, become one of the most precisely maintained ceremonial traditions in the American military. The birthday cake is wheeled in. The most senior Marine present and the most junior Marine present cut it together using a ceremonial sword, whose flat blade comes down on the white frosting with a formality that no one in the room treats as unusual. The Commandant's birthday message is read aloud. The ritual is observed at every Marine installation in the world, in every time zone, by Marines of every rank and every specialty. What November 10th functions as, for anyone who has served in the Marine Corps, is a shared birthday in the fullest sense of the phrase. It is not any individual Marine's birthday. It is the Corps' birthday, which means it is, by extension, the birthday of every Marine who has ever served. The celebration is a mass shared birthday across rank, across specialty, across the entire span of the institution's history. A Marine born in January, and a Marine born in August, and a Marine born in September all stand together in the mess hall on November 10th and observe the same founding date as though it belongs to them personally, because in the particular logic of institutional identity, it does. The formality of the Marine Corps birthday tradition is worth noting because it makes visible something that is usually less structured, the way a shared institutional origin date functions as a bond between people who might otherwise share very little. Any two Marines meeting anywhere in the world have November 10th in common. It is a piece of common ground created not by biology or geography, but by the deliberate construction of an institutional calendar. The ceremony that surrounds it on the actual date is the annual renewal of that common ground. The sword, the cake, the commandant's message, these are the mechanisms by which the institutional birthday remains felt rather than merely known. The cake itself, with its white frosting and its ceremonial cutting, is doing a specific kind of work. It is making the birthday visible, giving it a physical form that can be touched and shared in portions among everyone present. The sword is the marker of the occasion's weight. This is not a casual celebration, not a gathering organized around convenience, but a formal acknowledgement of a specific date's significance to a specific community. And the reading of the commandant's message is the moment when the date is given language, when what November 10th means is stated aloud in terms that every person in the room already knows and is hearing renewed. Across the world from those Marine mess halls, in the historical record of the North American Great Plains, a different kind of shared birth period recognition operated with different mechanisms and a different understanding of what the sharing meant. Among the Lakota Sioux, children born during the same seasonal period were recognized together in ways that the historical and anthropological record shows carried genuine social weight. The seasonal cohort was not simply an observation, it was a social structure, a bond that would accompany the children who shared it through the rest of their lives. The timing of a birth in the Lakota framework placed a child within the turning of a season that had its own character. A child born in the season of the deep cold was born into a different set of associations than a child born in the season of the returning geese or the season of the ripening chokecherries. The children who shared a birth season shared that character in a way that the social structure recognized and built on. The cohort bond created by a shared birth period was, in some respect, parallel to the age grade systems documented in East African societies, a formal recognition that people who arrived in the world at approximately the same time in the same cycle carry something in common that is worth acknowledging and organizing around. What the Lakota practice and the East African age grade systems have in common, across the considerable distance between them, is the recognition that a cohort is a social resource. People who arrive together in the same season or the same year have a basis for solidarity that does not require explanation or construction. It exists in the fact of their roughly simultaneous arrival. The ceremony that recognizes the cohort does not create the bond. It acknowledges one that the calendar has already made and gives it a form that the community can use. A Lakota encampment at the turn of a season, the light changing in the way that marks the passage from one part of the year to the next, and the children born during the recent seasonal period being recognized together in a ceremony whose specific details vary in the historical record, but whose function is consistent. These children arrive together, and the community is marking that, and the mark will travel with them. The recognition is as quiet as most of the important things in a child's life are quiet. There is no fanfare. The season turned, children were born within it. The season has turned again, and the community is noting what happened and what it means. It is one of the things that the historical and anthropological record keeps returning to, regardless of the culture being examined, that people find the shared birth date or the shared birth season and then do something with it, and that what they do tends to involve gathering. The Balinese assemble in a courtyard, the Lakota recognize a cohort, the Württemberg congregation fills a parish hall, the Marines wheel in a cake, the Versailles courtier makes a note. Each response is shaped by the specific social architecture It occurs within the tools and languages and institutions that the culture has available. But the underlying response, the impulse to find what is shared and bring it into a ceremony, is recognizable across all of them as the same impulse operating in different registers. The parish hall in Württemberg, on an evening in the 1740s, or the 1750s, or the 1760s, would have been lit by tallow candles whose smell was domestic and familiar, and the tables would have been set with whatever the parishioners had brought, and the pastor's voice reading the birth names from the register would have carried in the close, warm air. 4 people, or 5, each with their own life in the community, each known to every other person in that room, brought together by the fact of having been born in the same month in the same parish. The month gave them a connection that no amount of neighborly proximity had created on its own. The celebration made the connection visible. What the pastor was doing when he read those names from the register was making a particular kind of claim that these people, assembled under the same calendar month, had something in common that was worth acknowledging in the company of the whole congregation. The claim was modest. No theology required it. The community calendar simply made it sensible. If birthdays are occasions worth observing, and if several birthdays fall in the same month, then gathering them into a single observation is efficient and also, perhaps without anyone having reasoned it out explicitly, more fully communal. A celebration that belongs to 4 people is a celebration that brings more people into the warmth of being honored. The arithmetic of shared occasions is an arithmetic of inclusion. The Marine Corps tradition works in the same direction from a very different starting point. Where the Württemberg parishes gathered individual birthdays into a collective occasion, the Marine Corps began with an institutional origin date and extended it to every individual who joined the institution. The movement is reversed, but the destination is similar, a shared date that creates community across people who might not otherwise have it. The formality surrounding November 10th, the ceremony, the sword, the message, is proportional to the scale of the institution and the deliberateness with which the shared date was constructed. The Württemberg tradition arose without apparent design. The Marine Corps birthday was formalized with the full awareness of what it was being asked to do, which was to give the institution's members a shared occasion that would function as a bond. Both traditions and the Balinese Powukon celebrations and the Lakota birth season recognition and the quiet notation in the Versailles court diary, all of them are responses to the same discovery, which is that the calendar keeps producing shared dates, and that shared dates keep offering themselves as the raw material of community. The forms the response takes are entirely determined by the social worlds within which it occurs. The impulse that produces the response seems to require only that people live near enough to each other to know when they were born. The gamelan in the Balinese courtyard produces a sound that carries across the compound and into the surrounding streets, and people who hear it and know the Powukon calendar know without being told what the occasion is. A 210-day cycle runs without interruption. The day returns. The people the day has gathered assemble. The music marks the occasion. This has been happening in one form or another across the centuries that the Powukon calendar has been observed, and Mead and Bethun's fieldwork from the 1930s made it visible to readers who had no access to that courtyard, but who could, through their records, understand what was happening there and why it had its particular character. The value of Mead and Bethun's documentation is partly that it captured in writing and photograph something that would otherwise have remained entirely internal to the communities being studied, and partly that it placed the Powukon birthday tradition in the comparative record where it could be set beside the Württemberg parish practice, the Marine Corps ceremony, and the quiet notation in the Versailles diary. The comparison does not flatten these traditions into a single thing. They are genuinely different. The Paucan calendar's internal logic, the Lutheran parish's relationship to its church register, the Corps' institutional identity, the court's astrological framework, none of these is interchangeable with any other. But the comparison does reveal that the impulse running through all of them is consistent and old and widespread. An evening in a parish hall in Württemberg, the candles burning lower, the names read and acknowledged, the tables beginning to empty, and 4 people who were born in the same month going home through the same cold air with the particular feeling of having been placed together in the community's attention. It is a modest feeling. It does not require extraordinary ceremony to produce. The calendar arranged it, and the parish made a ceremony of what the calendar had arranged, and the ceremony left its trace in the church record that a later reader might find, running a finger down the page, and recognize as the record of a shared birthday, observed communally in a place and time when communal observance was simply what a parish did with the facts of its members' lives. The court diary at Versailles left a different kind of record, more guarded and more oblique. 2 names, 1 date, a small mark of significance. The Paucan celebrations left the record that Mead and Bateson made of them, supplemented by the continuing practice of the tradition in Bali itself. The Lakota birth season recognitions left traces in the historical and anthropological literature that are less detailed than some of the other records, but consistent enough to establish the practice's existence and its social function. The Marine Corps left a tradition that is still practiced today at every installation in the world, every November 10th, with the cake and the sword, and the message that addresses every Marine simultaneously as though the founding date belongs to each one personally, which, in the logic of institutional identity, it does. What all of these records share is the evidence of an impulse that does not seem to require cultivation or instruction. People find the shared birthday and they make something of it. The forms are wildly various. The materials are whatever the culture has to hand. The underlying motion toward the shared date, toward the acknowledgement of it, toward the gathering it generates, is constant. The Balinese Paucan calendar has been running for centuries longer than any of the other traditions mentioned here. Its 210-day cycle, unrepeated across the solar year, its days accumulating their ceremonial identities and their communities of shared birth across generation after generation of Balinese life. By the time Mead and Bateson arrived with their notebooks and their cameras in the 1930s, the practice of gathering on a shared Paucan birthday was not a new idea being tried out. It was an old practice that had been refined across centuries of use into something with exactly the texture and weight it needed. The early morning, the gamelan, the courtyard, the people arriving from different parts of the village, these were the form the impulse had found for itself over a very long time. A Louisiana veteran and a California recruit standing in the same mess hall on November 10th have nothing in common except the uniform and the date, the uniform they chose. The date was given to them the moment they joined the institution, and the ceremony that surrounds the date on its annual return is the mechanism by which the date becomes felt rather than merely known, the way the sword coming down on the white frosting makes November 10th real in the body rather than just in the mind. The way the commandant's message spoken aloud in a room full of people who have all made the same commitment gives the date a weight that a calendar entry alone could never achieve. The parish pastor in Württemberg, reading the birth names from the register, was doing something structurally similar with much simpler materials. The register was the record, the names were the community. The reading was the ceremony that made the shared month real in the room, that turned a coincidence of timing into an occasion. The candles, the tables, the gathered congregation, these were the form the impulse had found in that particular corner of the 18th century, in that particular arrangement of Lutheran community life. And the Lakota children, recognized at the turn of the season in which they were born, were entering into something that would follow them, a cohort identity, a set of relationships with the other children of the same seasonal period, a bond made from the same material that made the Württemberg shared month, and the Balinese Paukan day, and the Marine Corps November 10th. The simple, unchangeable fact that the calendar had placed several lives on approximately the same ground, and that the community had decided that fact was worth recognizing and doing something with. In the long record of human arrangements for living together, few things are as consistent as this. The shared date keeps appearing, the community keeps noticing it, and the form of the noticing, whatever shape it takes, a court diary entry, a ceremonial sword, a village courtyard at first light, a parish hall with candles burning, is the community's particular expression of an impulse that the historical record suggests has never required much encouragement to appear. The calendar makes the coincidence, the people make it matter. The last evening at Versailles that this particular court diary entry reflects was probably ordinary in all other respects. Courtiers moving through the gilded rooms on the business of their ambitions. The king somewhere in the building, the usual calculations being made and revised. And on one page of one diary, two names beside a shared date, the ink by now entirely dry and permanent, a small notation of the moment when the social machinery of the most formally organized court in European history paused, very briefly, for the same discovery that a Balinese village and a Württemberg parish and a Lakota encampment and a Marine mess hall have all made in their different centuries and their different languages, that the calendar is always arranging meetings, and that someone is always somewhere, finding them worth marking. The impulse to mark what is shared, to bring the shared birthday out of the records and into a room where people can stand in it together, does not appear to need instruction or justification. It appears in places that share nothing with each other except the basic human arrangement of a community and a calendar. The Paukan cycle turns. The November 10th returns. The parish month closes and opens. The seasonal cohort is recognized at the turn of the season. And each time, the people the date has gathered come together in whatever form their particular world makes available to acknowledge that the calendar placed them on the same ground, and that this, quietly, without drama or announcement, is worth knowing about. The Lakota children recognized at the turn of their birth season carry that recognition with them for the rest of their lives. It becomes part of how they understand themselves in relation to the people beside them, the ones who arrived in the same seasonal window, who were marked together, who share the character of the season that formed them. The ceremony did not create that bond. It found a bond that was already there in the timing of their arrival, and gave it a name and a form and a place in the community's ongoing account of itself. That is what all of these traditions have done in their different ways with the same raw material. The calendar keeps providing it. The communities keep finding uses for it. And the record of those uses is one of the quietest and most consistent threads in the long human story of living together and looking for the things that make that easier. The shared ground, the common date, the impulse toward gathering that is as old as any calendar human hands have ever kept. The room at Monticello is quiet in the early afternoon of the 4th of July, 1826. The light comes through the window at a summer angle, falling across the floor in a long pale rectangle, and the house has the particular stillness of a place where people are moving carefully, speaking softly, attending to something that does not require much noise. The date is the first thing the room holds. It is the 50th anniversary of a document signed by a man who is at this moment still alive in that room, though only barely, and who does not know, cannot know, that the same date is settling over a house in Massachusetts with the same quiet weight for the same reason. Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello that afternoon. John Adams died at his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, a few hours later. Adams's last reported words included the observation that Jefferson survived, a small, ordinary act of thinking about an old friend at the end of a long life, and wrong in a way that could not have been known and was not discovered until the news traveled the distance between the two houses over the following hours and days. Both men had held on, by accounts written afterward, as though the date itself had some pull on them. Whether that is true in any medical sense is not something the records can confirm. What the records do confirm is that the date held both of them and then released them within the same revolution of the clock. The coincidence was remarked upon immediately and at length, and by people whose job it was to find the right words for things. Daniel Webster addressed Congress on the subject. Sermons were written. Eulogies returned to it again and again, not because anyone needed to be told that it was an unusual thing, but because the unusualness seemed to call for witness. The Republic was 50 years old, and its two most prominent surviving founders had chosen the word was used loosely and with full awareness of its imprecision to leave on its birthday. The date appeared twice in the same sentence, in document after document that year, one name on each side of it, as though the calendar had done something that language could only follow after the fact. What the calendar had actually done was be present, as it always is, holding dates the way a surface holds marks. July 4th was not an event the calendar produced. It was a date the calendar kept, and into which two very old men happened to arrive and then depart, in a year that made the arithmetic of their departure legible as something more than coincidence. The meaning that gathered around it was human, assembled after the fact, and real in the way that human assembled meaning always is, not prior to the event, but not separable from it either. There is a way of thinking about famous coincidences that takes them as evidence of some ordering force in events, something beneath the surface of calendar dates that draws significant lives toward significant alignments. And there is another way of thinking about them that takes them as the expected output of a world with very many events and very many dates, and a human attention that is highly selective about which alignments it notices and preserves. Both ways of thinking produce something true. The first produces the feeling that the world has intentions. The second produces the recognition that the world has patterns, which is a different thing, and in some respects a more interesting one. The mathematician David Hand, writing in his 2014 book on probability and coincidence, gave a name to the mechanism by which remarkable alignments accumulate in human memory: the look elsewhere effect. The idea is straightforward once it has been named. Humans remember and record the coincidences that occur. They do not, by and large, remember and record the cases in which notable figures' dates did not align in any memorable way, which is to say, the vast majority of cases. The effect is that the coincidences which do occur seem to represent a departure from an expected baseline of none, when in fact they represent the visible fraction of a much larger field of neutral events that left no particular impression. The birthday of John Adams landed on the same date as the birthday of thousands of other people who were not Thomas Jefferson. Those coincidences produced no sermons. The one that did was preserved, and its preservation gave it a kind of density, a sense of having been arranged, that the neutral cases never acquired. Hand's book sits in a moderately sized section of the library, where probability and human psychology share shelf space, a section that has grown considerably over the past few decades, as researchers became more systematic about documenting the gap between how improbable things feel and how hyperbole they actually are. The book is calm in its arguments, the way books written by people comfortable with numbers tend to be calm. The case it makes is not that coincidences are uninteresting. The case it makes is that their interest does not depend on their being rare. Something can be both expected in the aggregate and worth pausing over when it arrives. The Adams-Jefferson alignment is the most celebrated of the American founding era coincidences, but it is not the only one, and the habit of noticing and cataloging such alignments is older than the republic they helped to found. By the late 20th century, the practice of compiling famous birthday coincidences had become sufficiently systematic that reference books dedicated to the subject were published. Clifton Fadiman, whose long career as an editor and anthologist gave him both the patience for lists and the instinct for what belonged on them, produced a compilation of historical birthday coincidences that identified dozens of cross-century pairings among scientists, inventors, and artists. The pairings Fadiman collected did not require any particular metaphysical interpretation to be interesting. They were interesting the way any cross-referencing of the long catalog of human lives is interesting, because the catalog is very long. Now in the calendar has only 365 slots, and the pairings that accumulate across centuries are more numerous than the expectation of rarity would allow. Fadiman's compilation, worn from handling, sits on a library shelf with its spine titled at the angle of a book that has been consulted rather than merely owned. Its pages cross-reference centuries and continents with the quiet efficiency of an index. An artist born in one country in one century shares a date with a scientist born in another country 200 years later. A political figure and a composer share a date they never knew about, and the book records the pairing in the same neutral tone it gives to all the others, as though the calendar's long habit of placing different lives on the same date is simply a thing worth having on record, which it is. The pairing that has drawn the most commentary from the scientific community is not the Adams-Jefferson shared death date, but a shared birth date that sits on the calendar 12 days after the New Year. The 8th of January 1942 was the date on which Stephen Hawking was born in Oxford, England. The 8th of January 1642 was the date on which Galileo Galilei died in Architrave, in the hills above Florence. The gap between them is exactly 300 years, and it runs from the end of one scientific life to the beginning of another, a span of 3 centuries during which the study of the physical universe was transformed beyond any single mind's capacity to have predicted. Hawking acknowledged the coincidence on more than one occasion, and his acknowledgment had the particular character of a scientist allowing himself one small unscientific pleasure. He noted, accurately, that a great many people are born each day, and that the coincidence therefore proves nothing about the relationship between his work and Galileo's. He noted this while being, by various accounts, quietly pleased by the connection. The two positions are not contradictory. A person can understand that a coincidence is the expected output of a system with many dates and many lives, and still find something satisfying in the specific coincidence that involves them. the satisfaction is not a claim about causation. It is something closer to the feeling of a detail fitting neatly into a frame, the recognition that the world occasionally arranges itself in ways that would have required considerable effort to arrange on purpose, and that it does so without effort, as a byproduct of simply continuing. Galileo was born in Pisa in 1564, the year that also produced William Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, a coincidence that generates its own small literature of commentary. He spent his later years under house arrest at Arcetera, where he continued to work despite the conditions of his confinement, dictating material to students and visitors, and producing in the last years of his life some of the work for which he is now remembered. He died in January. The date of his death was recorded in the parish register at Arcetera, and it sat there quietly in the register for 300 years until someone noticed that it matched a date on a birth certificate in Oxford, and the pairing entered the catalogue of calendar coincidences that the 20th century liked to maintain. Hawking's work concerned itself, among many other things, with the nature of time, its direction, its origin, its relationship to the physical laws that govern the universe. There is a mild irony in the fact that the coincidence most associated with his biography is a temporal one, a question of dates, a matter of when. The irony does not mean anything in particular. It is the kind of detail that is pleasant to notice and that carries no further obligation once it has been noticed. The calendar placed his birth on the same date as Galileo's death, without reference to either man's field of inquiry, just as it placed Lincoln and Darwin on the same morning without reference to either man's subsequent work. The calendar is not editorial. It holds dates the way a ledger holds entries, in sequence without comment, available for whatever cross-referencing the people consulting it wish to perform. The 12th of February, 1809, fell on a Sunday. It was a winter morning in a log cabin in Harding County, Kentucky, where a boy named Abraham Lincoln was born to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. It was also at some point during the same day a winter morning at the Mount, a Georgian manor house in Shrewsbury, England, where a boy named Charles Darwin was born to Robert and Susanna Darwin. The date held both of them simultaneously in two different countries, in two entirely different circumstances of birth, with no awareness of one another, as dates always hold the lives that fall on them, without preference, without distinction, without any particular arrangement of the available light. The coincidence was not widely noted during either man's lifetime. It accumulated significance gradually, in the way that retrospective coincidences do, as the scale of each man's contribution became legible in historical perspective, and as the pairing of their birth dates began to appear in the catalogues and compilations that the late 19th and 20th centuries assembled. By the time both men's centenary arrived, in 1909, the coincidence had become a standard item in the literature surrounding both of them. By the time the bicentennial arrived, in 2009, it had generated its own conferences, publications, and extended meditations on what it means or does not mean to share a birth date with someone whose work altered the framework within which subsequent generations understood their world. Lincoln transformed the political and moral architecture of the country that produced him. Darwin provided the biological framework within which the question of human origins was subsequently understood. The two transformations are not causally connected. They do not reinforce each other in any direct way. They belong to different fields, different geographies, different scales of operation. What they share is a date, a position on the calendar that the year 1809 occupied briefly and then moved past, leaving the two boys it produced to make their way forward through the decades that followed, toward the work that would eventually make their shared birthday a fact worth noting. There is something in the Lincoln-Darwin pairing that the other famous birthday coincidences do not quite have, and it has to do with the breadth of the transformation each man produced. The calendar has placed scientists with scientists before, and political figures with political figures, and the pairings are noted and filed in the compilations. And the Lincoln-Darwin pairing crosses categories in a way that makes the cross-referencing feel slightly more improbable, even when the mathematics of the thing makes clear that cross-category pairings are as likely as any other kind. The feeling of improbability is not a reliable guide to actual improbability. The feeling is generated by the same mechanisms that produce the broader human tendency to underestimate shared birthdays, the tendency to think of coincidences as departures from a baseline of orderly separation, when the baseline is actually one of continuous overlap. The two boys born on the 12th of February in 1809 did not know about each other for a long time. Darwin died in 1882, having produced the major works that would define his legacy. Lincoln died in 1865, in circumstances that placed him permanently at the center of the national story he had done much to shape. Neither man's biography records any awareness of the shared birthday as a significant feature of their lives. The awareness came later, carried by others, by the people who compiled the lists, who maintained the catalogs, who noticed that the calendar had been holding a pairing that the men themselves had not thought to look for. Clifton Fadiman's compilation identified pairings of this kind by the dozen, the cross-century, cross-category alignments that accumulate when a sufficiently long and systematic attention is brought to the calendar. The book's method is simple. Take a birth date, search the record, find who else arrived on that date in a different century or country or field, and set the names beside each other on the page. The result is a kind of accidental anthology, a collection of pairings that were not sought out by the people in them and were not arranged by any force other than the mechanical regularity of the calendar and the statistical behavior of a large population distributed across a fixed number of dates. The compilation does not argue for any particular interpretation of the pairings it contains. It presents them as a good compilation should, and leaves the interpretation to the reader. Some readers find in the pairings evidence of a pattern deeper than probability. Others find in them a confirmation that remarkable coincidences are exactly as common as they should be, given the size of the human population and the length of the historical record. Both readings are available from the same pages. The book holds them without adjudicating between them, the way a calendar holds dates, without preference, without comment, with only the quiet persistence of the record itself. The record has been kept for a long time. The practice of noting when notable people share birth dates is documented across several centuries, and the motivations for keeping the record have shifted over that time. The astrologers who maintained court records in early modern Europe noted shared birth dates because the positions of the celestial bodies at birth were understood to confer specific characteristics, and people who shared a birth date were therefore understood, within that framework, to share something of their fundamental nature. The historians and biographers who compiled catalogs in the 19th and 20th centuries noted shared birth dates because the coincidences were interesting as coincidences, as evidence of the calendar's indifference to the categories by which subsequent generations would organize their understanding of the past. Both motivations produced records. The records are different in their interpretive frameworks and similar in their basic practice: the careful noting of a date, the placing of a name beside it, the acknowledgement that the calendar held more than one significant life at the same moment. The practice persists because something in the coincidence retains its interest regardless of the interpretive framework brought to it. The date does not change. The names on either side of it do not change. What changes is the account of what the shared date means, and the space of possible accounts is wide enough to accommodate very different ways of understanding the world. The look elsewhere effect, as Han described it, operates not just in how coincidences are remembered, but in how they are sought. The searcher brings a topic to the catalog, a birth date, a significant figure, a field of inquiry, and finds the coincidences that the search turns up, while the much larger field of non-coincidences remains unexamined. This is not a flaw in the search, it is the nature of searching. Every search is from somewhere, toward something, and the things that are found depend on where the searcher began. The calendar is large enough that any starting point will eventually produce a coincidence worth noting if the search is patient and the catalog is thorough. The catalog Fadiman assembled was thorough. Its pages are organized by date, and moving through them produces a particular reading experience, the experience of watching the calendar move through its cycle while names accumulate on each date in layers, century over century, field over field, geography over geography. The 14th of March produces Albert Einstein, born in 1879 in Ulm, and a sequence of other figures whose proximity to him on the calendar is in most cases the only connection they share. The 25th of January produces Robert Burns and Virginia Woolf, born a century and a half apart, a pairing that has been noted often enough to have its own small literature of commentary. The calendar continues, page by page, holding everything with the same neutral regularity. The pairing of Adams and Jefferson on the 4th of July remains the most discussed of all American historical coincidences, partly because the date itself carries so much prior significance. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration was not an ordinary day. It had been anticipated, marked, prepared for. Celebrations were held across the country. Both men were known to be alive and failing, and the sense that the anniversary might be the last one either of them witnessed had been part of the public consciousness for some time before the day arrived. When both of them died on that day, the coincidence landed on a surface already prepared to receive it, a population already attending to the date, already aware of its significance, already watching for what the day would bring. The coincidence did not need to be sought. It arrived into a field of attention that had been waiting for it. Webster's congressional oration on the subject was delivered in August of 1826, a few weeks after the deaths. The oration is long in the manner of the period, and its treatment of the coincidence is careful, neither dismissing the strangeness of the alignment nor claiming more for it than the evidence could support. Webster described it as a visible and impressive proof that great principles outlive the men who espouse them, and as a coincidence that the country was entitled to read as a sign of the unity of the founding work, if it chose to. The "if it chose to" is doing considerable work in that formulation. Webster understood that the coincidence was available for interpretation without being determined by any particular one. The interpretation the country largely chose was providential, the sense that something beyond ordinary probability had arranged for the two men to leave together on the nation's 50th birthday. This interpretation was available because the coincidence was genuinely striking, and because the culture that received it had frameworks ready for the interpretation of striking coincidences as meaningful in a theological or metaphysical sense. The interpretation was not compelled by the facts. It was one reading of the facts, produced by people who found it compelling, and preserved in the historical record alongside the facts themselves. 200 years of distance from the event does not change the date. The 4th of July, 1826, holds both men's deaths with the same neutral persistence it has always had. What the distance changes is the range of readings available to the person consulting the record. The providential reading remains available. The statistical reading, the one that places the event within the larger field of expected coincidences produced by a large population distributed across a fixed number of dates, is also available. The two readings do not cancel each other. They sit beside each other in the record, the way two names sit beside the same date in a genealogical register, sharing a slot without displacing each other. The genealogical register is in some ways the most honest model for what the calendar does. It records who arrived when. It does not interpret. It holds the arrivals in sequence and makes them available for whatever consultation the person opening the register has in mind. The register does not know what the names beside each other will become. It does not know that the two boys born on the 12th of February in 1809 will each, in their different ways, produce work that subsequent generations will still be consulting 2 centuries later. It records the date. It records the names. It holds both without comment, as a good register should. Fadiman's compilation is a kind of extended register, built from many smaller registers: birth records, death records, parish entries, court diaries, and organized around the calendar rather than around geography or family line. Its cross-referencing is the cross-referencing of the date itself, which connects everyone born on a given day, regardless of any other connection they may or may not share. The book continues its silent work of connection on whatever shelf it currently occupies: a library, a bookshop, a private collection, its pages still holding the pairings assembled decades ago, the names quiet beside each other in the way that names in registers are always quiet, doing nothing beyond being present in the same record at the same date. The calendar's long habit of placing different lives on the same date is not a habit it cultivated. It is simply the behavior of a measurement system that is smaller than what it measures. 365 dates cannot accommodate all human lives without overlap. The overlap is inevitable, and its inevitability means that every significant life shares its date with a large number of other significant lives, and that the catalogs assembled to track these coincidences will always find more than the expectation of rarity predicts. The pairings continue to accumulate, the catalogs continue to be consulted, the dates continue to hold the names placed on them, without preference, without arrangement, without any particular awareness of the significance the names will eventually acquire. Hawking's January 8th has, since his death in 2018, acquired a second pairing, a second layer of significance added to the one he acknowledged with characteristic precision during his lifetime. The date now holds the end of his life, on the 14th of March, 2018, a date which is, in the astronomical community, already associated with Einstein's birth. The calendar does not acknowledge the neatness of these arrangements. It simply holds the dates, and the people consulting the records do the acknowledging, as they have always done. The room at Monticello with its afternoon light is somewhere in the historical record, in the accounts written by people who were present, in the descriptions compiled by those who came after. The light in the room does not survive. The date does. The date is in the record in the way that all dates are in the record, as a fixed point available for consultation, holding whatever it held when it passed through the present and became the past. The 4th of July, 1826, holds the deaths of 2 men who signed the same document 50 years before, and it holds this fact with the same neutrality it brings to everything else on the calendar: the births, the deaths, the beginnings and endings that accumulate across centuries and continue to accumulate, the calendar holding all of them without running out of space, because the space it offers is not physical, but temporal, and time does not fill up the way a room fills up, or a register, or a shelf,